All right, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Katie Monahan, and I'm a communications strategist here at the Ohio Arts Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, Documenting Your Classroom Experience. Before we get started, there are just a few housekeeping items to go over. First, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, and this just helps to cut down on any feedback issues during the presentation. So if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the Q&A box in your control panel, and we will save all of those for the end of the presentation. We'll make sure to get to all of them. Next, if you have audio issues or trouble connecting, we recommend refreshing your browser. And if that doesn't work, try logging off and logging back in. And finally, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the recording on our YouTube channel by the end of business on Monday, February 24th. So if you aren't able to catch the entire live session or you'd like to listen again, you can find it there. So that's it for housekeeping, and now I'd like to welcome the OAC's Arts Learning Team, the dynamic duo of Chiquita Mullins-Lee and Jared Small, to introduce today's presenter.
All right, thank you, Katie. This is Chiquita. So first I just want to kind of, by way of introduction, talk about why is it important to document what happens during an arts education experience in a classroom. So you might want to assess the impact and successes of that classroom experience, to strengthen areas of weakness, to replicate processes that work, to share successes with other arts educators, and to continue to attract funding, support, and continued residency opportunities, because we definitely want to do all of that. And plus, our newly updated statewide Ohio teaching artist roster, which our colleague Jared Small is going to talk about in a moment, has a newish application process. And one of the questions that we ask is that people upload additional support materials that you feel more deeply connect your application with the skills and experience you possess as a teaching artist. And so you're asked for things like student work samples and project documentation. So how do you go about effectively documenting what happens in your classroom? Well, our expert is going to tell us that today. So I'm going to kick it over to Jared. He's going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Chiquita. Hi, everyone. This is Jared. Good afternoon. Chiquita mentioned the Ohio Teaching Artist Roster, a relatively new resource here at the Ohio Arts Council, but it's a labor of love amongst a number of partner organizations. Just want to touch on what this is and why we're so excited that it's rolling out. The Ohio Arts Council, in partnership with Ohio Dance, the Center for Arts-Inspired Learning, the Ohio Alliance for Arts Education, and Art Possible Ohio, have come together to create a new statewide resource that currently has 44 high-quality teaching artists on the roster. And it can be used by schools and teachers and administrators, other community organizations and other community leaders to locate teaching artists in their region or around the state who might be interested in working with them in classroom settings and out of classroom settings and other community settings. So we certainly encourage folks to head online. You can go to our website, oac.ohio.gov, and check out the new Ohio Teaching Artist roster under Resources, the Resources drop-down menu, and take a look at what we've got. We're also happy to say that we'll be accepting applications again from teaching artists who reside in Ohio come this spring, May 2020. So if you're listening to this and you might be interested in joining this teaching artist roster, feel free to give us a shout out at the Ohio Arts Council. We'd be happy to walk you through the process and what you can expect. And like Chiquita mentioned, today's webinar is sort of in a direct alignment with this new teaching artist roster and what we ask for on the application process. But certainly this webinar will be relevant to not only teaching artists, but to arts educators around the state, to folks who work in the education sector, arts and otherwise. We've been looking forward to this webinar for quite some time now. Today, our expert, Jerzy Drozd, is here with us. He is on the Ohio Teaching Artist roster. We think he's a great person to speak to these kinds of things about documenting your classroom experience. So with that, we are going to turn it over to Jerzy, and we're looking forward to what's ahead. So Jerzy, take it away, please.
Thanks, Jared. And thank you to Chiquita and Katie. Thank you to the Ohio Arts Council for having me here today. This is a subject I'm really passionate about, helping more people be more effective teaching artists, because I think creating meaningful connections between the public and the arts is one of the noblest things we can do. So what's going to happen today? What are we going to do? We're going to go over, I'm going to give an overview of what kinds of classroom documentation I create and look what that is. And then we're going to, about, a quarter of the way through, there's going to be a thinking exercise. So for those who are tuning in, even watching the video, having a pencil and a little piece of scratch paper nearby just to capture a few thoughts, I think will be useful. I'm going to give you some prompts to think about, and I'm going to describe what those prompts relate to, at least in my work, and how I use these prompts to then, in the third part of our discussion, unpack them and unpack your classroom experiences. And, or let's say you haven't done that many classroom visits yet, unpacking your art experiences making your particular discipline that you want to teach, to create that into a classroom document, like a lesson plan, some kind of evidence of what people can expect from you when you come to visit their organization, or the school, library, etc. And then finally, we're going to look at why even do all this? Why is this so important to all involved? So first, establishing some credentials. Who am I? My name is Jersey Drozd. I'm a cartoonist and teaching artist, which is to say a person who makes graphic novels and then teaches people how to make graphic novels. The latest book of mine you can find in stores right now is Science Comics Rockets, which I co-authored with my wife, Anne. And it is the history and science of rockets is told by the animals who participated in rocket history. Yes, grizzly bears are involved in rocket history, tortoises, dogs, ducks, and more. And then, yes, I also do all sorts of visits starting in 2007. That's when my teaching artist career began, when I worked with a program called the Art Serve Michigan. It was their literacy arts comic book project, through which I worked with 10 Detroit public schools, serving as a visiting artist, visiting 6 classes a day. And then after school, I was leading professional development sessions with the instructors in order to make what I was bringing to the classroom replicable, teach the teachers how to use comics in the classroom. And I've worked with a variety of organizations over the years. For many years, I taught at the Ann Arbor Art Center in Ann Arbor, Michigan, before I moved to Columbus, Ohio. Yes, I moved to Columbus, Ohio. I know I've already heard all the jokes about coming from Ann Arbor. As an artist, I did not know about the animosity between Columbus and Ann Arbor. Now I know, and look, I moved here. But I've served as the programming coordinator for the Ann Arbor Comic Arts Festival for 11 years, which is a free comics festival, multi-day festival in Ann Arbor, where cartoonists from around the country descend on the town and all weekend long lead free hands-on workshops for kids, teens, and adults. And I coordinate with all the artists to create all of that programming. And I currently teach at the Columbus College of Art and Design, teaching their Saturday morning art programs for kids. I taught a multi-day workshop at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, where I was training teachers how to use comics in the classroom. I've worked with other advocacy groups like 826 Michigan, and I was recently hired on to serve as the interim executive director for the Cartoon Crossroads Columbus Comics Festival here in Columbus, Ohio. October 1 through 4, everybody, if you want to come. It's a free comics festival. If you are somebody who is interested in communicating with images, I highly recommend you come to this free festival. It's an amazing show, and it's multi-days, and it happens at venues all over Columbus. And then for years, I've worked with various schools and libraries throughout the Midwest, and visited, done presentations at comics festivals like the Toronto Comic Arts Festival, Salt Lake City Comic Con, and so on. So I've been doing this a long time, and so I hope that establishes that I've been doing this. So then we get to what is classroom documentation. Now, I have a free PDF you can download right now at comicsaregreat.com/CCC. It's right there on the screen. And it's a 64-page kit, which actually has a lot of out-of-the-box, ready-to-lead workshops with evidence and extensions and lesson plans, and even some rubrics for evaluating student work, and even a lot of justification for administration on why it's important to teach this material in school. So I use this to not only train teachers, but also to give to other teaching artists to say, like, here's how I have managed to navigate my career with documentation like this. And we're going to pick this apart right now, break it into its component parts, like chunk it out so this is digestible, because right now we're looking at a sea of text and a couple of images. What is the anatomy of this thing? So first up, we have the title and the description. Now, what is that? Well, a title in description sets expectations about what's to come. You may notice that as this webinar started, I said, here's what we're going to do today. So that we're not surprised by anything. We know there's always deeper levels to get into beyond a simple sentence, but at least getting people to understand what's going to happen, I think, eliminates any ambiguity or anxiety. But also something I like to do, and we're going to dig at this more later, is I like to hint at possible crossover to curriculum-based content, especially when I'm working with hosting organizations that teach a variety of disciplines. Then we get to purposes. What's the purpose of this thing? You're establishing the primary learning activity. Now, I know there's lots and lots of learning that goes into any kind of learning activity, but like I would describe this as if you hope the students walk away with just one thing, what would it be? That's the primary learning activity. And then also I like to offer some rationale as to why we're doing this particular activity with this group at this time. Is this somebody you've worked with before? Is this your first time visit? What's the proposed skill level that you're dealing with? Why would you use this particular activity for this particular group? And then we get to the process. And the process is an explanation of the procedure of the activity in as much detail as possible. What are we going to be doing in the room together for the next hour to 2 hours? And what are the different stages? I like to also propose some questions that may be posed in the classroom. Why and how questions are my personal favorites. We can cover that more in the Q&A if you really want to know what I think about why and how questions. And the questions serve a couple of purposes. It's good for me to have on hand as to remind myself of ways to explore this topic with the students, but also it's good for the teachers if they want to replicate this work in the classroom later. But the big idea is that you're establishing key concepts to be explored during the activity. And then we get to extensions. An extension is a suggestion to explore more complex ways of approaching this particular topic or more simple ways to approach this topic based on student skill level or the dynamic of the room. We'll dig into that a little bit later too. Right now I'm just defining the parts. And then finally, the last piece is reflections. These are prompts to get the students and the teachers and you, the teaching artist, thinking about how this activity changed them. I'm going to say this a lot of times today, and I really honestly believe this, is that I don't think it's unreasonable to say that we are in the business of changing lives. If you are walking into a room to teach somebody something, in some way or another, you're hoping that they're different at the end of it. In other words, you're changing lives. And I think that if you are walking in to a room to do that, I think it's very reasonable to suggest that it's worth stopping and reflecting on when that happens. Change can be simple or big, but it's always profound. And it's worth thinking about. And capturing some ways to examine that idea is, I think, a pretty good idea. Okay, now comes the part where we're going to actually do a little bit of writing. I got some prompts saved up for you to think about. What I'd like you to consider just for a moment before we move on to the prompts is think about a classroom activity you have been teaching. So something that if I were to ask you to walk into this classroom and go teach this particular subject right now, you'd be ready to do it. Maybe you don't have the documentation for it, but maybe you know how to do it. Or something you'd like to teach. Or if you haven't done that many visits, even just think about your particular discipline that you want to teach, how you make the art. And I'll try to give you prompts that lead in any of those different sorts of information or different approaches. So first prompt is this. Pencils ready. What's the primary thing you hope the students will learn? What's the big idea? What's the one takeaway? What's the one thing you hope that if you could help them understand something in this particular workshop, this school visit, or even in thinking about your discipline, what's one thing you hope that everybody would be a little bit better at through their experience with you? To give you time to consider this, I'll give you an example from my own experience as a cartoonist and teaching artist, a person who teaches comics. I often use mini comics as an example in my classrooms. And a mini comic it's very small. It's like a quarter of the size of a letter-sized sheet of paper, and it's roughly 8 to 16 pages. Usually I try to stick to 8 pages because an 8-page mini comic you can make in 2 hours or so, like hour and a half to 2 hours. You can usually complete an 8-page mini comic. Now, there is the product that you're making. That's the thing, that's the artifact you're creating. But what are you learning through the making of this particular artifact? Well, with any art discipline, you can learn a variety of things, right? So what's the main one that you want them to walk away with this time? Let's suppose we're going to talk about composition and viewing angle, okay? You're making an 8-page mini comic, and every 5th panel, you have to introduce something into the foreground that obscures the view, and you have to introduce something in the background that creates a middle ground. Let's look at every 6th panel or every 3rd panel, you have to change the viewing angle so that it's slightly askew, and you have to write the narrative so as to knit these ideas together so it makes sense. But you're getting the students to think, you know, in a real concrete and abstract way at the same time, how the way we look at things changes the way we feel about things. Yes, they're making a mini comic, but the primary activity is exploring composition of viewing angle. Could be moment choice, right? Comics are made of panels, and there's like panels where you have lots of information, panels where you have less information, panels where you're closer to the character, farther away from the character. So this example I have on the right of the screen is a moment choice and visual rhythm example where we're exploring how, okay, well, the size of the panel has a certain kind of visual rhythm, the amount of words in the panel has a certain amount of visual rhythm, and the amount of images in the panel, like drawings in the panel, have a certain amount of visual rhythm to them. Right? And so those measurements on the side are like the class's interpretation of the first number is how many beats the panel size has. The second number is how many beats the amount of imagery has. And the third number is how many beats the text has. Right? And that can be, yes, we're making a mini comic, but we're exploring visual rhythm and moment choice. Or it could be something as simple as just risk diminishment. Sometimes if I'm doing a multi-week course, the first week we make a mini comic, and I don't give them any instruction as to what it's about. I don't give them any parameters. And just say, we're just going to make a mini comic. I'm going to time you, and every 5 minutes we have to move on to the next page. So we're guaranteed to finish this particular book. Why? So that next week, when things get a little daunting, we get into some heavy-duty areas into making comics, some like abstract and weird places, and you say to me, you the student, say, I can't do it. I can point to this piece of evidence that says, yes, you can. You just did it. You just finished a mini comic last week. We're going to do it again. We're going to do it, but we're just changing some of the details, right? So it could be, as you could see, like you could take any activity in your discipline and you could break out like one chunk. This is the thing that I hope they will learn at the end of this thing. So the question for you is, in your discipline, what's one thing you hope they will learn? And then what are some incidental things that might be learned? Incidental, like here's the main thing we're trying to teach. But as we know, making art is a very fluid and complex and sometimes circuitous thing where we're rounding back on ideas over and over again, and we're pulling from various kinds of thinking to communicate the ideas that we want to communicate with images or music or dance. And again, I can't speak to your discipline, but I can speak to my own as a way of like giving a food for thought or like a framework for thinking about this. Again, let's think about making a mini comic. In making a mini comic, even if we're focusing on risk diminishment, composition or viewing angle or moment choice and visual rhythms, we're going to be engaging with design principles such as shape, size, line, and color. Like different shapes make us feel different things. Why did you make this panel more triangular and this one more square? Why did you have this character covered in spikes and this character smooth, right? Size, why did you get close to this character and far away from that character? Why did you use a bumpy line instead of a smooth line on that word balloon? Or even color, why did you use warm colors instead of cool colors in this, right? So the incidental that you will learn in making a mini comic is general principles of art that are explored in your classroom on a regular basis. That's worth capturing. That's worth thinking about. What are some extra things that you just will naturally learn through engaging with this medium, right? You might be teaching, incidentally, probably peer review. Peer review is an important term in education, right? The students are going to want to share their work with one another, especially if they're excited about it, right? Sharing the work in progress to get feedback, whether the feedback is a high five or, hey, maybe you should try that. This is going to be teaching social learning. Something I do in my classroom all the time is I talk about how the world of cartooning is very small. All the cartoonists know each other, and therefore, if you are mean or a jerk, word gets around fast, and it'll be difficult for you to find work. So there are some codes of conduct in cartooning, and one of the things I tell my students is the 3 rules of the code of conduct of cartoonists are: 1, we build each other up, we don't tear each other down; 2, when we don't know something, we ask for help, because it's awesome to not know something, because that means that you have to learn a new thing. And 3 is if someone asks for help and you can help, you offer help, right? So built in at the very front of my classes, which that has a very indirect line to the central learning activity, but there's a social component to that I'm also teaching incidentally through my school visits. And you might be teaching, oh yeah, here's the example of the students all working together. You might be teaching service and expression driven design. So again, thinking about comics as the framing device. I lead a series of workshops where the goal is to actually create a printed anthology of the students' work. And then the students, once the work is printed and assembled, they have a signing. They have a public signing where the public can come and get copies of the work and talk with the students about the work they make. And so now you're teaching emotional learning. The students are going to learn how the thing they make interacts with the world and vice versa. This is in addition to the central idea of leveling up their skills as visual storytellers. Another prompt for you to consider. Does the activity skill building benefit the student in other non-obvious areas? So let's consider making a mini comic again. Something I've heard from parents when they come to pick up students for my workshops, and maybe they get there a little bit early and they hear some of the interactions happening in the room, and they'll pull me aside afterwards and say, wow, you're teaching writing as much as you're teaching drawing. Now, this is an important idea that I'm going to underline a couple times throughout this discussion. Of course, my thinking is, of course I'm teaching that because comics is a visual narrative. You're communicating ideas and narrative through images. And there's writing. When you talk about narrative, you're talking about writing. But to somebody who doesn't think about comics all that often, they're thinking it's a visual medium, therefore it's going to be a class about drawing. This is the right way to draw something, and this is the wrong way to draw something, right? And so when they express that surprise, it's an opportunity for me to say, like, yeah, that's right. We're teaching writing, and writing a narrative, albeit writing visually. I am certain that there is other skill building you've noticed in your work, things you've gotten better at in other aspects of your life through the engagement with your medium or your discipline. And there's other curriculum-based skills that the students could learn by interacting with your medium. This is an opportunity to capture that idea. What other non-obvious areas would you improve upon in your life through engaging with this medium? I would even argue that making comics teaches you memory retention because you have to draw from your imagination a lot. And so you have to study and use reference. And in using that reference and in drawing something over and over again, you get more, you memorize more. All right. Can you list 3 to 5 specific actions that lead to the overall activity? The procedure. Now, I want to step back and say, I'm an artist too, and I understand that in making comics, yes, there's a procedure, but it is not necessarily a linear procedure. Maybe I'm going to pencil the drawing first, then I'll ink it, and then I'll notice that there's some problems with the art, and I'll go back and repencil a piece, right? Like, you're going to move around a lot, but it still gets chunked. It's chunked into little discrete areas of activity that add up to the finished thing. And remember, again, to the novice, they just see the finished thing, and so like we see this a lot with students. They start with those surface areas, and it's our job as teaching artists to make them step back and realize that there are layers that go into the full understanding and expression of the thing that you're finally making. So, how do we think about that? How do we chunk that information? Well, how does the activity start? Whether it's the activity of you participating in the medium or the discipline. Or is it how do you prepare the students to begin? How do things begin in the room? And then think about midway. What are the students doing when they are in the thick of it? What is the activity what activity is happening when they are midway, when they're really engaged with the full activity itself? And then how do you conclude? How do you honor their learning? There's three steps right there. I am certain you can chunk it out into even more discrete areas of activity. How do you adapt to different classrooms? Those of us who have been doing a lot of school visits, I am certain you've run into this situation before where you get into the room and the students show up with a higher skill level than you anticipated. You have your ABCs of doing this activity, and the people show up and they have a high level of fluency and are ready to be challenged even more than what your lesson plan has. What happens when students show up with less prior knowledge or experience than you had anticipated? Oh, I thought we were going to do this really awesome exercise about visual rhythms. These are students who have taken very few art classes before and maybe aren't ready to deal with something as abstract as that. We have to, simplify and maybe come up with like a lower risk activity. What do you do? What have you done when dealing with students with different learning styles? One of the great things about being a teaching artist is that we get to teach to different learning modalities, visual learners, other kinds of learners who are not necessarily always addressed and honored in traditional curriculum-based content. That's one of the values that we provide. So how do we make ourselves more adaptable to that? How have you worked with different groups in the past where there's different either skill levels, different kinds of learners, or even different levels of anxiety engaging with art? I remember having an experience one time where I visited a school where they literally had no art program. And these were fifth graders who made it to fifth grade who had never taken an art class. And I walked in with this assumption that every child under 11 years old likes to draw. Virtually. Okay, I'll qualify that a little bit. Virtually every child under 11 likes to draw. And I was faced with a scenario where there was an 11-year-old kid who just was so afraid of getting it wrong that they started crying in the classroom. What do you do about that? Right? How can you make yourself more adaptable? How have you made yourself more adaptable? Here's a big one. How has teaching your craft or subject changed the way you think about the craft? I think a lot of us will say that one of the cool things about this line of work is it gets us to be more thoughtful and engaged with our medium, because in unpacking it to make it transmissible to a novice audience, we have to really ask ourselves why we're doing it this way at all. Why this way and not that way? What thoughts and ideas and justifications and rationalizations can we come up with for our approach? And one of the things that I've become intensely passionate about over the years after becoming a teaching artist is the way we represent an invisible sense through images, and that is sound. And we're all familiar with, the 1960s Batman show turning like the sound design of comics into like these pop culture glyphs of pow bam. They get used in like, newspaper headlines, pow bam, comics aren't for kids anymore. But when you think about it, when you really step back and think about like, why would you make a sound effect orange instead of blue? Why would you use a wavy line instead of a smooth line? Why would you change the different letter sizes, right, to communicate different meaning? Because you're representing 5 senses with only 1 sense in a comic. And that presents a lot of interesting challenges. And I've begun to think of comics as more like visual poetry in a lot of ways, in that it's not literal, right? So, question for you. How has teaching your craft changed the way you think about your craft? What's different about the way you engage with it now versus when you first started teaching it? Or, if you haven't done that much teaching, what ways do you anticipate you think you'd be changed through actually teaching your craft to other people? And then another interesting one worth considering is, are there any fundamental misunderstandings about your craft that you would like others to better understand? When I go to gatherings of various groups of people who may or may not be cartoonists, and people find out that I make comic books for a living, they say, a lot of times I hear, oh, that sounds like fun. What do you do for your real job? And I'm sure we've all experienced some form of that comment at one point or another, because for better or worse, arts is, it isn't often considered a viable career path. It's considered an extra thing in society instead of a vital thing as we know it to be. And because like there's an entire generation of people who grew up thinking that comics was junk literature, like when I was a child. I remember reading this is from a comic called Amethyst, Princess of Gemworld from 1982. By an absolute genius of the cartooning craft named Ernie Colon. And I remember noticing on some of these pages, like this one in particular, where panel 2, a static image, gets used for 2 discrete moments of the narrative. We read panel 2 twice in reading the page. It makes perfect sense when we read it. We don't think about it, but he tricks us into using the art twice. And then panel 3 is also part of panel 5. And I remember noticing this as a child and like really just the top of my head blowing off, just like, how did he do it? How is he guiding me in this way and to get such economy out of his art? And at the same time, I'm having teachers saying, yeah, you should be reading real books. Stop reading this drivel, So something I like to think about is, how can I advocate for my work? How can I make the public have a richer and more meaningful interaction with the medium that I so love? So that, I mean, and let's be mercenary about it for a moment. The more people that appreciate and understand your medium, the more people are going to engage with it in a financial capacity in some form or another. And then we all have a better chance of making a living at, being artists, right? So ask yourself, think about your medium. What are some fundamental misunderstandings you've encountered, and how, this is just, you don't have to have the answer for this, just this is a food for thought question. How might we address this as if the person knew absolutely nothing about it? Well, that's worth thinking about too. Okay, now take a deep breath, cleansing breath, and then we're going to go back into the classroom documentation, and we're going to take all this information that you collected. It's okay if you don't have it all filled out, because we were going through that kind of fast, and that's why I'm grateful that this is being recorded, so you can go back and listen to the prompts at whatever speed you need to. And then you can go through this activity again. We're going to look at the different chunks of the classroom documentation and ask yourself, based on your classroom experiences, how you would plug in this information. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on what these pieces mean. I defined them. Now let's really analyze them a little bit. So the title and the description. So this is stating the main thing you plan on teaching in a way that explains it to a beginner. I said this earlier, I'm going to keep saying this. What's obvious to the master is invisible to a beginner. There are things about comics that I see written in 40-foot tall letters in the sky that are on fire. But when I show that to other people, it takes a lot of describing and guiding and directing. And it's because I've spent the better part of 30 years thinking really hard on this stuff. I shouldn't expect everybody else to have a level of understanding that matches that. That's why you are a teaching artist, is to enhance, increase, and to connect people with that understanding, right? So you really have to do a little bit of perspective taking on this. Like if I was looking at this for the first time, if I was engaging with this for the first time, what would be puzzling to me? It might be worth bringing in some non-practitioner friends into this to help you sculpt this language. But the main thing that's going to happen, described in a way that is that makes it clear to somebody who's never engaged with it before. And another thing that I think is important is that, in my opinion, good teachers are good learners. And that means you have an obligation to teach the teachers you're working with too. So the title and the description should be a way to bring in and get some buy-in from the teacher you're going to be working with if you're teaching at a hosting organization like a school or a library, some teachers, librarians, also administration in an art center, helping them understand like what it is that you're actually going to do. We're always teaching, hence the title. You're defining success criteria, or you're beginning to define success criteria. You're meeting the teacher halfway and being of service to them and their curriculum content. This is why I like to, so something I do, and I did this for this particular webinar as well. I do this with all of my school visits. Anytime I'm working with a new hosting organization, I ask them, can you define what you hope will happen through my interaction with your students? Can you name 3 things? 3 things that I hope, or that you hope everybody will have like a richer understanding of, or some like new skills developed around, or at least a pathway to deep understanding on. And if I'm visiting an elementary school, I'll connect with the school administration, even teachers, and say, like, are there any subjects that you're teaching right now that are like kind of hot subjects that you're finding the students having difficulty wrapping their heads around or difficulty engaging with? And then maybe I can bring those subjects into my presentation and tie it into comics somehow to reach those students who maybe have different learning modalities. You are there to be, and I'm going to talk about this more a lot in a second too, is you're there to be in service to these people. So I don't expect myself to know exactly how this is going to plug into their curriculum-based content. I reach out to them and I gather that information. Okay. So this is the main thing you plan on teaching, described in a way for somebody who's never done it before, and hopefully tied into some other aspects of what they're teaching in that institution. Purposes. This is a promise that real learning is going to take place, right? You are not there to be a fun distraction in the room. You are there to reinforce what is going on in this particular organization, in this institution. You're doing this for real. This isn't a silly frivolity. This is you like being a real service to the students and the teacher in the room. And you, at this point, you're going to suggest how this learning activity will benefit the classroom in ways beyond the initial scope of your lesson. So you're teaching skills to improve classroom management, you're bolstering curriculum-based materials. Remember when we were thinking about all that incidental learning that we were unpacking from our own teaching experiences. Then the process. The process sets expectations to build trust. A good friend of mine, Rob Stenzinger, once said that nothing happens or nothing gets built without trust. You have to build trust. And I think of like a good experience versus a bad experience at the doctor's office. I'm sure a lot of us have had, unfortunately, both, right? When I think of the good experiences that I've had, it's situations in which every action is explained before it happens. The doctor's office isn't a place where you want surprises to happen, typically, right? I love novelty. I actually enjoy surprises, not in the doctor's office, right? I like it when they explain what's going to happen and prepare me. Even if I don't understand everything that they're explaining to me, having that laid out is like, this is the procedure of things that are going to happen today. And then including questions, this is, especially if you're visiting a school where you are only going to be there for a certain amount of time. Maybe you do some sequential visits, but you're not there all the time. The teacher is. And including questions equips the teacher to be a participant in the experience. By including that in your documentation, in your lesson plan, the teacher can say, okay, I see where they're going with this. I see the line of thinking that they have. And even if I have no experience doing this, you're the teaching artist, you're the expert on this particular craft, but now the teacher can be part of the discussion in the room when the students are actually doing the thing. And it helps them replicate what you've taught after you've left. So you can create more than just that one impression. Like you can have a lasting impact on groups of people with that. And then going back to this idea of like, we're here to change lives, right? And then the clarity of the concepts explored, this is important too. By spelling all this out and writing out all this procedure, this justifies your visit to the school administration, making it easier for you to get hired. That's kind of an important piece of the puzzle as well. How do you make this stuff sustainable? And then we get to extensions. So we talked about, what do you do in different rooms? What do you do when the skill set is different than what you set out to work with? This makes your lesson plan replicable to other grades and skill levels, which increases the amount of the different audiences you could work with if you want to. But this one's big. It prepares you for success in situations where the student skill level doesn't match your lesson plan. Being adaptable is kind of an important skill for being a teacher, because you're going to be dealing with different groups of people all the time. And then we get to reflections once again. What are reflections? Well, once again, you're in the business of changing lives. This is a prompt to get everyone noticing that, and to get them in the habit of reflecting on their learning. Something I do when I do multi-week school visits is at the very end, the last session, I'll sit down with the students and I'll say, it's been a privilege to work with you, and it's been fun watching you achieve mastery over this medium over the time we've been together, but I'm about to go off to another school. And, I just met some of the students there, and they're really nervous about doing this. They've never drawn a comic book before, and they're not sure if they can do it. And man, it's just me and these 30 kids. What am I going to do? So I'm hoping that now you guys have this mastery. Could you give me some advice on what I might say to those nervous students? And it becomes this session where the students are owning their learning, because what they're telling me is stuff they learned in the classroom. But now they get to own that knowledge, and they get to teach me how to be a better teacher. And they're really teaching me this too, because they're also in that reflection activity. They're speaking back to me things that matter to them. So I'm getting that feedback. So there's a psychological aspect and an emotional learning aspect of like reinforcing this with the students, and making them, letting them own the knowledge and the learning, but then also actually giving me like some really important data on like what was actually meaningful in the classroom. I think it's important to like think about like how you've changed, what kinds of changes have you noticed in the students, and how can you address that in asking some questions, like giving yourself some prompts in the documentation to also inform the teachers, like, yeah, we're gonna think about this. There's gonna be a moment where we stop and pause, have a purposeful pause, and think about what we've been doing together. Okay, so I hopefully I've given you some sense of how to do this, how to unpack your experiences and how to apply them to this 5-part structure. But one thing when I was a kid going to school that I found really challenging was teachers didn't always do the best job when I was growing up explaining to me why it's important that I know how to do this in the first place. I mean, you're here, so I guess you have a sense that this is important, but I think underlining the word why in like black crayon 3 times is something that I find immensely valuable. When I was in high school, and I knew from the age of 11 I wanted to be a comic book artist. That's all I've really ever truly cared about as an activity, like a way to spend my time during the day. And so when I would take algebra classes and the instructor didn't make me understand, like, how does this relate to what I'm actually going to do someday? They couldn't get me there. It was really hard for me to stay committed to the material. And then I had a geometry teacher who actually looked me in the eye and said, well, if you're going to be drawing comic books, you're probably going to be drawing a lot of geometric shapes. And having a sense and understanding of how shape works and how to apply math to render shapes in 3 dimensions probably be helpful to making comics. And I was like, all right, I'm in. And I got straight A's in that class, right? So I have a personal relationship with this word why. I think it's important, and I think it's worthy to navigate some of the questions, some justification for why we're going through the trouble of creating all this documentation to prove our value to organizations. Well, I like to think of teaching arts as a vocation, service-driven vocation, and you're in service to multiple parties. So, of course, what's obvious is that you are in service to the students. And students need rich, meaningful interactions with the arts. That's why we're here. That's why we do this. And preparation, creating this kind of documentation, it prepares you to focus on your improvisational moments in the one-on-one teachable moments with the students, right? I love walking into a room and figuring out what I'm going to do that day on the fly based on what the energy and the dynamics are of the room. It's, of course, that's part of the fun of this thing. But the improvisation is more of like selecting which pre-made thing, it's a pre-made lesson plan developed ahead of time that I can resort to, so that the real improvisation happens on a student-by-student basis. So I can customize the actual teaching for what that individual student needs. So you could walk into a room and say, I'm going to do this lesson plan. The room's energy or skill level is different. I guess I better figure out something right now. That's exciting. And it is. But how much more rich will it be for the students if you have something else designed for that particular dynamic ahead of time, so that you can focus on the actual individual teachable moments with each individual student. Another party you're in service to is the teachers. Teachers, we only need to turn on the news for a little while to see that the teachers are navigating more pressures than ever, all the time. And I think regardless of that, even if you took that out, let's say that they were having, this unprecedented renaissance of support and respect and admiration from society at large. Either way, the less ambiguity you can introduce into their lives, the better. Less ambiguity is almost always better, right? Unless you're watching like a cozy mystery movie. If you are truly showing up in the spirit of service, removing ambiguity is always good. What does that mean? Clarity of purpose, clarity of setting expectations. And you're also there to inspire them and maybe even help them find new inroads to teaching their own content to their more creative students. So your visit could have an impact that lasts not just on the students, but also on the teacher if you show up in that spirit of service. And I think having good documentation to prepare you and them for success is always a good thing. And then the third party that you're in service to is the administration. They have a responsibility to use their funds for the betterment of their students. And making the why of your visit as clear as possible means less friction in hiring you. I mean, you could read that as a mercenary statement, I suppose. Like, yeah, this makes it easier for you to get in and get all the jobs. But it also is, like any good business, it's being of service to the customers, providing good value to the customers in terms of what the visit that you provide, but also making it as easy for them as possible to understand what value you provide. I would argue that this is something that a lot of us artists, at least, again, speaking of myself as a cartoonist, when I'm pitching graphic novels to publishers, I have to make them understand what this thing is going to be as clearly as possible with words. I have to write a document that says, here's what this graphic novel will be. It'll be this many pages. It's going to be this genre. This is the shelf it will go on. It'll be literally shelved between these two very popular books, and this is what the story is going to be about, and so on. This is something that we do a lot in our careers, whether we're seeking grant funding or collaboration with a funding partner, and also as teaching artists when we're approaching hosting organizations. Now, I'm going to have to mute this video real quick so it doesn't blast our ears out. Let's talk about video real quick, because we've been talking a lot about capturing documentation in terms of writing lesson plans and creating some kind of promise of the activity that's going to happen in the room. But another thing I like to do is capture video of some of my teaching experience, my classroom experiences. Why? Well, you're here to lead a trail of competence. You want, like, part of this is what a CV or a resume is, right? It's like it's evidence that you know what you're doing, and video is pretty unambiguous evidence of you that you know what you're doing. And it's pretty simple to do nowadays. I mean, it's actually, it keeps getting simpler. Like, you could actually you could take an old smartphone. Like, I have a decommissioned iPhone SE. It's like a small iPhone that I don't use as a phone anymore, but I use it as a video recording device. I just put it on a cheap tripod. You can get like adapters to connect an iPhone to a tripod fairly cheaply, like, less than $5. And I'll just set up the tripod in my classroom. And I don't, as a general rule, I try not to capture the students' faces. As you can see in this video, it's pointing more at the board I'm working with, but you can hear the students in the room. And what are you capturing when you create this video evidence? What I'm looking for is the dynamic between me and the students. So I'm showing, this is what it looks like when I teach, and this is the way the students interact with me. This is the way I interact with them. Am I the kind of teacher who demands, rapt attention and you listen and wait for the Q&A at the end? Or do I want a lot of interaction in the room? What kind of questions do I ask the students? How do I sort of direct and prod and lead the conversation? And what does that dynamic look like? It's a demonstration of a learning activity. So in this particular example, we can see on the screen, this is me teaching how design principles contribute to the way we hear sounds in our heads. And then later on in the video, it leads to visual rhythms at large in comics. But it's demonstrating, so you have this lesson plan in front of you that describes the procedure. Well, now you can see the procedure happening, this little demonstration. And it's evidence of your presence. What does the room feel like when you're in it? And in this particular video, when you listen to it with the sound, you can actually hear the students. And one of the students is commenting offhand how much they enjoy this class to another student. And I was so grateful that I got caught on video. It was not prompted. It was just like one of those nice little pieces of, like, I'm so glad that I had the camera on that day. Let's also talk about podcasting. So this is another thing that I do. Mute that video. Whoa, I apologize for that. There's the video playing now. I do a weekly video podcast with a designer friend of mine, a designer and life coach named Rob Stenzinger. And for 300-something episodes, 300-something weeks, we've shown up every Thursday and stream live and talk about a subject in art and how we think about it. And I think of this as, like, it's not only a weekly dojo where I get to mentally spar with somebody, it keeps me sharp, keeps my speaking skills leveled up. But we occasionally invite guests on the show, which broadens your network of fellow artists. It improves your chances for gigs. And then, again, it creates another piece of evidence of my presence and my thoughtfulness. This is who I am. This is what you can expect from me when I come to visit your institution. So with that, I will close. And I want to thank everybody once again for showing up and having me here today. Thank you to the Ohio Arts Council. I'd be glad to field any questions you may have for as long as you want.
Great. Thank you so much, Jersey. That was fantastic. There was a lot of oohs and ahs on this end of the presentation from Jared and Chiquita. I think we know exactly why we picked you to lead this. This was so fantastic. So again, we'll open it up to questions. As a reminder to folks, feel free to use the Q&A box on your control panel to type in any questions that you might have. And it looks like we do have a few. So Jersey, what would be be your number one tip for a teaching artist who has been doing this kind of work for a long time but hasn't been used to documenting it, writing a purpose statement, primary takeaways, et cetera? Is there a simple thing that someone can do to start getting used to documenting their classroom activities?
Well, I mean, like for me, what helped was just having that template. That in making comics, I found that, and I'm sure any artist will probably have similar experiences, where if you think about how in your art, chunking it into discrete areas of concern actually makes the work go faster. So like when you first engage with art, you're thinking of it surface out, or surface in rather, right? You're just trying to replicate what you see on the surface, but without a fundamental understanding of what's underneath, it's really hard to replicate that surface feature of the thing that you're looking at. And the moment I understood, I start with a sloppy pencil sketch, and then I refine the pencil sketch, then I do inks, then I do colors, and then lettering, and so on. Not only did it make the work better, but it made it go faster. So I would say, if you can, because you're already doing it with your art, if you can chunk out those experiences into various realms of concern. So when you say like a purpose-driven art statement, well, that's a big expression. It can mean a lot of things. So try to say, okay, just nail it down to 3. If you say, what are the 3 purposes of you visiting a classroom? What do you hope that you'll get out of it? What do you hope the students will get out of it? What do you hope the hosting organization will get out of it? And really try to think of like what, like in the spirit of service, like how will the organization be better if they more thoughtfully engage with this medium? And then if you could just write out like a few words of each of those 3, now you've got the beginnings of a artist purpose statement, right? You can construct that into a paragraph. And then with my lesson plans that I developed, it follows that structure every time. Okay, and just like with art, I would also say, don't feel like you have to start with the title and description. Start with the procedure. And when it comes to making art, I found that nothing freezes you like the abyss of the blank page. Sitting there staring at a giant blank sheet of paper it can be extremely paralyzing. And so I tell my students, just get the pencil moving. Just start writing anything, and something will happen. And it activates, well, this is I don't have any evidence to back this up, but like this is the language I use in the classroom. Is like it activates that part of the brain that will get you thinking of more ideas. So don't feel like you have to start with the title and description. Start with the procedure. Start with the purpose. Start anywhere you want in those 5 little chunks, and see if you can build your way out from there. And those pieces should and will inform each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. I think that's really helpful, kind of breaking it down and branching out. It doesn't have to be this perfect, complete thing right from the start, right?
And like what you said, Jersey, about just getting the pencil moving. Sometimes when it comes to documentation or any kind of work we do, really, whether you're a teacher, an administrator, or a teaching artist, just starting somewhere and going from there, I find tremendously helpful. So great to hear that solid point you made.
For sure.
Thanks.
So another question. So this goes back again to the documentation and kind of writing out your experiences. It can seem a little overwhelming, like, it takes up a lot of time in addition to actually teaching the lessons themselves. Do you have any advice on time management and committing to writing activities and plans down?
Oh my gosh, yeah. Yeah, this is, art is really funny in that it asks so much of us. And so like you find the people who do it like, as a career, they really, really love it because you kind of have to with the amount of time you commit to doing it. And the same thing with teaching arts. So in terms of like, again, making it more sustainable, manageable, and chunking it out. Something I like to do, and I don't do it every time, but I try to make a habit out of doing it like once every couple classes that I teach, is I keep a, there's a thing called the Emergent Task Planner. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's on daveseh.com, DAVESEH.com. And it's sort of a planner that you use to, it's by its name, it's emergent tasks, like things that pop up during the day, and how do you like arrange them and make them manageable. And I've been using these for 9 years now as a way to manage my day, a time management tool. But aside from that, even if you don't want to use a time management tool to like sort your day, one thing I do on my day planner is I have a box entitled "What Good Happened?" And it's a prompt for me to say, okay, reflect on the day. capture some experiences and why they stand out. Why do these things matter? And because these are notes to myself, they are not Tolstoy, right? I'm not writing beautiful sentences for the ages. This is just capturing a few snippets of thought. And I try to do that in my classrooms every once in a while. Like I said, every couple classes, I try to say, did anything happen today that was especially meaningful to stand out in any way, even if it was a difficult thing? And I'll capture a few thoughts like, yeah, Edwin he was really a handful today. This is how I tried to handle the moment. I don't know if I was successful. Continue to play with that. So I'm creating this breadcrumb trail of what's happening in my classroom. And then that can go into, I can go back and once a week I review my ETP. I have a Sunday self meeting when it's usually about 30 minutes where I just look at my emergent task planner from the past week and gather those notes and gather those reflections. These can be on sticky notes. They don't have to be on anything fancy. But when you start to accrue these 1 minute, 2 minute observations, you'll find in just a couple weeks, you will have a pretty rich trail of documentation to begin with to build a formal piece of documentation. A lesson plan, yeah, it can take some time to make one of those. But the good news is that that 64-page kit that I made, that took me months to make. A lesson plan, if you just want to make just one as a piece of evidence to begin with, you can probably, set aside a couple hours over the course of a couple weeks to work on it. And again, I hope people will study the one that I shared, because it's not, there's a lot of justification documentation in there. I would say you don't necessarily need to have that. I would say just focus on the lesson plan itself, where you have the title, you have the procedure, you have the purposes, you have the extensions. That alone is pretty strong evidence that you've thought this thing through. And even if it's something that you've been doing on the fly, you can capture those little bits of experiences on sticky notes and collect it to at least one lesson plan to begin with. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's great. I think also I like how you mentioned kind of scheduling a self-meeting, actually putting that time on your calendar and making it an appointment, just like anything else, probably definitely.
Yeah, let me empathize with fellow artists, because I say this a lot. The saddest day of my life was the day I knew I needed to keep a calendar. So it meant, I'm a real grown up now, and I'm not this freewheeling artist that I thought I was going to be. Where there was years ago in a Marvel comic in the Bullpen Bulletins, which was the letters page kind of section of the book, Jim Salicrup, who was the writer of Amazing Spider-Man, described the life of a comic book artist as sitting in a studio drawing and eating Frankenberry all day. And as a 10-year-old, I thought, that is the life. That is what I'm going to be doing as a grown-up. And I didn't think about, because how could I? Taxes, day planners, calendars, scheduling, So I empathize. It sucks to think about having to schedule a self-meeting and actually tracking your time. But I find them to be immensely useful as a way to lean on. How did that line go in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade? I put it in a book so I wouldn't have to remember it. I think about it like that.
That's fantastic.
I just wanted to say that I like the really broad approach that you've taken to all of this information. I mean, from the pre-planning to the planning to the video documentation, all the way across the board. I just wanted to affirm just how fantastic this webinar has been.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think we have time for one more question. So let's see here. So, Jervy, you mentioned the importance of teaching the teachers. Have you ever experienced a teacher or an administrator or any other kind of hosting organization who had a very specific vision in mind that was incongruous with how you work, what you believe, or your artistic process? And if so, how did you work through this? And if it's not happened to you, how would you work through it if something like that were to happen?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that has happened many times in my career, and it's a tough situation to navigate, because once again, you're dealing with a scenario where not everybody in the room has the same relationship with your craft or your medium that you have. And what's obvious to you is not necessarily obvious to everybody else. And sometimes I would say some borderline insensitive or insulting things can be said about your art or about your medium in those kind of discussions. So the case that I think of is I was in a room where I was doing a series of classroom visits to an art class. So I was reinforcing and bolstering art education at this high school. And I'm coming as to do a unit on comics. Comic books, I think I've probably made it clear that I'm really passionate about them. I really love the medium and what it can do. And one of the aspects that I love about it, and I know that this attracts young people to it, is it's very easy to create artifacts that are easy to reproduce and distribute. Mini comics, part of the charm of them is they're very cheap to make, and then you can give them to all of your friends. Like I often use mini comics as business cards instead of actually a business card, because the mini comic will tell you more about who I am as an artist than a business card will. And so that's the mindset I'm walking into the room on. I'm going to do this 5-week session with these high school students. We're going to make some comics, and then we're going to print the comics up, and the kids will be able to distribute them to their friends, and they will be published authors. Now, the art teacher in the room is teaching more what we could call traditional arts: painting, sculpting, illustration. But their mindset is art is the artifact of art is the object itself, right? The painting is the artifact. You don't replicate the painting. That's not art. That's a print, right? The painting is the art. Now, I'm in the room with this person, and I'm talking about what my plans are, and I say this business about making mini comics and redistributing them, and the teacher leans back and looks thoughtful and says, yeah, I really think it's important that we actually treat this like real art. and if I didn't have the presence of mind that I had, I could easily have found myself being like, okay, well, you just said that my work isn't real art and we're done here, right? But instead, I had, I thought, okay, well, why did you say that? What do you mean by real art? And then it took a little bit of talking and leading the conversation. Again, thinking how I talk to my students. I don't shut a student down. That's insulting. Don't say that. Well, why would you say this instead of that? Some language I use all the time is, why did you say this instead of that? I didn't say that. I'm letting them own the question, but I'm asking them to defend the question. And then I realized when she said, I think it'd be better if we hung the students' drawings in a case in the school, and she's coming from it from the standpoint of art is the physical artifact, not the replication. To which then, I came back and I said, well, that's a really cool idea. And I love this idea of honoring the students' work in such a way where the whole school can see it. Another cool thing that will give the students a little bit more agency as to who gets to see it is maybe we can do that. And in addition to it, make copies that the students can then hand to a specific group of friends that they want to own the thing. And then they can autograph the thing. And it's like a personalized note of the art to them. It wasn't critical to me that she have a deep and profound understanding in that moment of what I was bringing to the room. She just needed to know that I was easy to work with and I was willing to consider her input. And then hopefully through the 5-week course, I can bring her closer to where I stood on this particular spectrum of art. Did that address your question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that was great. I think you make a good point too in kind of keeping the lines of communication open. I thought it was interesting how you could have just taken that at face value and been offended and shut down, but asking the question, oh, that's interesting, why do you say that, or what do you think, or I think that's a really great way to handle that situation, kind of keep the communication open and not just completely shut down and come to the path.
Something else that I think a lot of us teaching artists have experienced, and maybe intuitively, but let me put words to it, is so when I was first training as a teaching artist, I was training under a really magnificent Jedi Master from the University of Michigan named Mary Jo Finney. And I remember when I developed my first lesson plan, or it was a syllabus. It was not a lesson plan. It was a 10-week syllabus that took me a lot of hours to put together. And I presented it to her and I was very proud and I was looking forward to getting the whole, this is my son and I am well pleased moment. And she looked at it and she said, this is great. You're not sticking to this, right? And I said, what are you talking about? This is my recipe. This is I've prepared myself for success. I'm just going to go into the rooms and just do this and it's going to be great. And then I started visiting different classrooms. Each classroom has a different dynamic, different energy. This classroom is 30 boys and you're going there in the springtime and it's right after lunch. Good luck. This classroom is first thing in the morning, very different energy level. And I learned that, what she was pointing at is that the lesson plan is a living thing and it adapts to the group that it engages with. And part of my job requirement is that I be adaptable to the rooms that I visit and to the administrators I work with, because once again, what is obvious to me about what makes comics so wonderful is invisible to somebody who hasn't engaged with them in that way. And it's unfair of me to expect them to see the greatness of the medium. It's my job. That's why we teach. We teach to bring people closer to things. And that teaching happens, like I said, all the time with any party that you're working with.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jersey. I think we have run out of time, but today was definitely full of some really great insights and experiences and a ton of useful information. I know Jared and Chiquita are thrilled to see what comes of this once our teaching artists watch this and make their applications for the teaching artist roster. We're going to see some great things, I'm sure. Did either of you guys have anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you as well. We appreciate the time, Jersey, and folks listening. I hope you can get some solid takeaways, and certainly follow up on some of his suggestions about going to those websites and those thinking exercises. Yeah, I took away a few things myself today, so thank you.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks for having me. This is a real pleasure.
Well, we were really grateful that you took the time to do this, and we're really grateful for everyone who took the time to listen in today. I encourage everyone to tune in next week. We have two webinars this month, which is exciting. So on Thursday, February 27th, we welcome Jane D'Angelo and Gabrielle Stefura of Ohio Dance, and they're going to talk about all things event planning. And so if you've got a festival or some other type of community event coming up, this one is definitely for you. So I think that's it for now. Yeah, Jersey, you're welcome to join us for that one too. But I think that's it for now. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their day, and we hope you tune in next week. Thanks a lot.